Great, welcome, and thank you for joining us for SICRAT 2021, a series of virtual seminars on critical topics in the conservation of earthen architecture. My name is Brooks Jeffrey. I'm a professor of architecture at the University of Arizona, and I'll be serving as the session moderator for this, our third of 5 seminars. And today's topic is understanding deterioration mechanisms in earthen architecture. Before we get started, I want to recognize that the University of Arizona occupies the original homelands of indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land since time immemorial, and we honor their legacy. As I did in the previous sessions, and apologies for those of you who are hearing this for the third time, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge all of those who have made SICRAT 2021 possible. First, our partner organizations, Vanishing Treasures Program, the National Park Service, University of Arizona's Office for Research, Innovation, and Impact, University of New Mexico Historic Preservation and Regionalism Program in the School of Architecture and Planning, and Cornerstones Community Partnerships. I want to thank my colleagues on the SICRAT 2021 Planning Committee, Lauren Meyer, Francisco Uviña Contreras, and Jake Barrow, who have been working incredibly hard under COVID conditions to create a virtual alternative to the TCRAT workshop we'd intended to host this year, but wanted to keep the momentum going until next year when we'll be meeting in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'd also like to thank all the panelists who have agreed to share their expertise, their experience, successes, and challenges in their work. As you'll see throughout the entire series of seminars, many represent National Park Service parks, but we also have active practitioners, academics, and representatives of community and tribal organizations, all dedicated to advancing the conservation of our earthen heritage. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the heroic efforts of Ashley Oliveros, events coordinator from the University of Arizona's Office for Research, Innovation, and Impact, who is the wizard behind the curtain of the registration process, Zoom logistics, and today is doing her magic to make this virtual event as seamless as possible. Thank you, Ashley. For those of you who are not familiar with the tradition of SICRAT, the seminar format, or TCRAT, the workshop format, this all began in 1994 as a cross-border program between the National Park Service and its Mexican counterpart, the National Institute of Anthropology and History, known by its Spanish acronym, INAH. This program convenes experts from the United States and Mexico to share current best practices and case studies, and works directly with communities on both sides of the border, using hands-on workshops to teach conservation skills, to help those communities preserve their earthen architectural heritage, and by extension, preserving pride in their community. In essence, the SICRAT TCRAT program is a community of knowledge, and we encourage all of you to engage with the panelists in this series, as well as with each other as part of this community. This year's virtual SICRAT seminar is intended to be the foundation for next year's TCRAT workshop, which will be held in conjunction with Terra 2022, the 13th World Congress on Earthen Architectural Heritage, taking place in Santa Fe, New Mexico in June of next year. Links to next year's events can be found on the SICRAT 2021 website, which is now posted in the chat. This website also has links to the Missions Initiative website, where we built up a library of resources, including previous TCRAT presentations and videos that still remain a great resource of instructional tools on earthen architectural conservation. Now, for those of you who weren't at the previous virtual sessions, let me provide some orientation as to how today's session will be conducted and how you can participate. First, each of these 2-hour sessions will be divided into 2 parts, a set of brief presentations by our invited panelists that will make up the first hour or so. Then we'll take a 10-minute break or intermission and come back for the Q&A part of the session on the second hour. To save time, I will only be introducing each panelist's name and affiliation before their presentation and then turn it over to them. If you're interested in more information on the panelists, please visit the SICRAT website for complete profiles of each of the panelists. We encourage you to ask questions during the presentations, but they must be submitted using the Q&A feature on Zoom at the bottom of your screen. And you may want to wait until the intermission to post your questions, especially if you think that your questions will be covered by another panelist's presentation. I will be monitoring and compiling these questions, as well as those already submitted during the registration process. And if they're not already covered by the panelists' presentations, we will use them as a framework for our Q&A discussion in the second hour. And just so that you know, the chat function in Zoom has been disabled for audience participants, but will be used by Ashley and the panelists to post links, additional resources, and other information. Finally, this and all of the SICRAT 2021 sessions are being recorded and will be available on the Missions Initiative website and eventually the Terra 2022 website, with the goal of creating a foundation of content for future TCRATs, including next year's in New Mexico. Now, on to today's topic, understanding deterioration mechanisms in earthen architecture. Our first panelist today is Frank Matero from the University of Pennsylvania. Frank, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Brooks. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. I'm joining you from Mountain Ute tribal lands in Southwest Colorado, where the rich tradition of earthen architecture is well represented in both the indigenous American and post-contact settlements and structures. As everyone on this call knows, Earth's versatility and adaptability to construction methods and local conditions has long supported its persistence as one of the oldest and most widespread of building methods. Whether we're talking about adobe or cob or monolithic walls such as rammed earth or pisé, earthen construction displays a number of important properties: good compressive strength, excellent thermal capacity, which is especially suitable for hot, arid environments. Yet earth is also relatively vulnerable to moisture, and all earthen buildings will deteriorate upon exposure to the elements without protection and frequent cyclical maintenance. This has been adapted for a better performance through the use of thick walls, deep eaves, raised foundations, and protective surfaces, which all assist in improving the performance of earthen building, as we can see in these examples in the Southwest. Simply put, earth is the most perfect, imperfect material to build with. My task this afternoon is to introduce our seminar topic on understanding deterioration mechanisms in earthen architecture. And I want to begin with a favorite quote from W.I.B. Beveridge, who in 1957 wrote in The Art of Scientific Study, the study of the causes of things begins first with study of things caused. In conservation, we spend a great deal of time on interventions, but these are only as good as our understanding of a building's performance, including its weathering and deterioration. So let me take a moment and deconstruct some of these concepts. How buildings, and I include in this case ruins as well, perform over time is a complex response of a structure's materials and its assemblies to the internal and external forces associated with the daily use, the exposure, the maintenance, and the repair of constructed works. We call that performance or behavior prediction. And the ability to withstand wear and decay, we call durability. All materials experience alteration over time. When that alteration occurs due to normal exposure and use, we call that weathering. When weathering is deleterious to the function and survival of a structure, we choose to call that deterioration. It's important to remember that deterioration is a multi-scalar phenomenon that occurs at different rates for different materials and under different environmental conditions. And later during our session, Evan Oskierko-Jeznacki is going to be talking a bit more about this. Regardless of the scale, all deterioration results in a change in the physical and sometimes the chemical properties of a material. And we see this as gross physical change. The performance of all earthen building materials begins with soil composition, including clay chemistry and grain size distribution, or granulometry, which significantly determines a soil's properties and how it has been best selected for use in construction. Those of you who are involved in earthen building know that the type of soil very much dictates how that soil can be used and limits the options in construction. This is best expressed through soil classification systems, which for engineering purposes focuses on grain size distribution of the clay, the silt, and the sand fractions. Over 50 years of modern scientific study of earthen heritage and even longer empirical knowledge of earthen building has resulted in a general understanding of how earthen architecture weathers. And I just show you two examples here. For example, these theoretical models of grain behavior and colloidal chemistry help explain the most prevalent decay mechanisms of dissociation that is associated with the physico-mechanical effects of the water-clay ratio, which we know as liquid limit and plastic limits, or on the left, or on the relative reactivity or swelling of different mineral clays, which we see here in diagram on the right. So at the micro scale, clay swelling and shrinkage coupled with decohesion of the clay silt sand agglomerate are the fundamental mechanisms responsible for soil destabilization, which will eventually lead to all scales of damage. So it starts at the micro level. We perceive it generally in the field at the meso and macro. And again, we'll be talking more about this later. We see this, as I mentioned, at these scales as characteristic conditions: coving at the top, basal erosion at the bottom, contour erosion across the entire surface, and ruddling in terms of focused, concentrated damage. All of these ultimately are water-related phenomena. These microprocesses can be aided by the presence of salts or the formation of ice within the pores of the soil, leading to additional material stress and fatigue. And eventually, with the loss of surface and the reduction in wall thickness, as we see in the middle image, the walls will begin to take on their characteristic weathered shapes and contours, cracking, so on and so forth. And this all will depend on the cyclical weather patterns, the wall geometry, and of course, any interventions which have been made in the past. Walls will wither to fanciful contours and eventually lean from basal undermining and a lack of lateral support from the original architecture, eventually leading to destabilization and collapse, as you see here on the right. Performance scenario production, which you see an example here for Fort Union on the screen, it's a useful evaluation method, even more so with climate change and the unanticipated responses of traditional materials and construction systems to these new environmental stresses. So let's take a simple and then a complex look through the aid of animation to see the common scenarios of earthen wall deterioration. As we go from a complete building to an incomplete building, we lose the roof, we lose the lateral bracing often provided through the roofing structure, we lose the protective plaster surfaces exposing the adobe or earthen core. We further lose additional protective elements such as brick coping or timber coping. And then we begin, we'll see the next phase. So here we see the scenario which leaves the adobe nucleus or the earthen nucleus vulnerable to further stressors. Now these stressors we understand in terms of individual different aspects of weathering, and they result in a dominant response mode. And I'm just going to go through these very quickly. Snow, particularly as a reserve or reservoir of moisture, can stay accumulated for months, depending on the orientation and protection, and eventually overwhelm the system. And we'll see that more of that in a minute. Wind can provide unseen forces, often complex in terms of positive and negative wind loading. Rain, of course, falling damp will typically erode unprotected vertical and horizontal surfaces in a gradual disintegration, creating the common rounded forms and rough surfaces and coving at the top. Freeze thaw, of course, will occur anywhere where there's moisture, causing, again, micro damage, which eventually accumulates into meso and macro scale. And finally, rising damp or ground moisture with or without the aided damage from salt crystallization, will cause a loss of bearing strength and deformation and collapse. The result to the overall wall is basal erosion and coving. And again, we can see these in this animation. Again, processes familiar to most. Here we see coving at the top, basal erosion at the bottom. Then we will see the walls deforming. We see both of those contributing to an unstable wall cross-section. And then we will get a whole host of characteristic out-of-plane phenomena, which causes the walls to bend, lean, pivot, and hinge. Okay, I hope you can see these walls wiggling and moving. Okay, let's go on. When we look at these in combination, however, we have a perfect storm of earthen deterioration. And again, those of you in the Southwest certainly are familiar with these resulting forms. And again, remember, we tend to see the in-process or final form. All deterioration, particularly earthen deterioration, is like watching a film where you're at any given moment looking at one frame in a continuum of evidence. And so here we see the characteristic geometries of the wall creating the forms we see today through differential erosion. There is little evidence-based research which has attempted to study or explain the range of variables alone and in combination that influence earthen building performance, including deterioration at the macro or site scale. Again, there's been tremendous advances in terms of understanding soil performance, earth material performance at the micro scale, but we have not, I don't believe we've done a good enough job looking at the combination of factors in tandem that create a synergistic decay phenomena. While all earthen structures display similar mechanisms of failure based on shared properties and construction methods, understanding and identifying the variables of deterioration in terms of the type, the extent, and the frequency as a function of intrinsic and extrinsic factors would allow conservators and resource managers to make better predictions about the site risk and the vulnerability, and therefore more effective treatment decisions. Again, Evan is going to talk about current research we've been conducting at the University of Pennsylvania at Fort Union National Monument with the National Park Service on developing a model for determining site vulnerability through a series of discrete studies of adobe performance at the micro, meso, and macro scales. Originally, this initiated as a response to climate change and its potential threats to earthen sites. But the project now really has broadened to consider the variables that influence how earthen structures deteriorate and how those variables can be identified, modeled, monitored, and ranked in terms of establishing a hierarchy of influence on the performance and deterioration of earthen structures. This whole process has been informed by the questions you see on the screen, particularly with a focus on legacy data, the idea of past records, past photographs, past treatments that can be mined for information about what we see today. And I'll end with this. The reason why this is all important, it would stand to reason that without a nuanced understanding of the significance of specific factors in the deterioration of earthen walls, diagnosis cannot be made or monitoring conducted to the degree in which informed treatments can be developed and applied as remedial. And I think in the case of earthen architecture, preventive responses to deterioration. So here you see that relationship between design material, fabrication, installation, environment, and intervention as it plays with the concepts of durability, damage, and repairability. So with that, I will end. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Frank. Yes, the next speaker is Evan Oskierko-Jeznacki from the National Park Service's Vanishing Treasures Program. Evan?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Excited to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm going to pick up from where Frank left off and try and provide a little bit more detail into some of these concepts in terms of earth and deterioration. And particularly, I want to try and present this concept of looking at earthen resources and earthen architecture from a systems approach. And I'm going to borrow some concepts and terms from general systems theories and things that came out of from the 70s in terms of how do we understand things as open systems. So I just want to open up with by saying that from a diagnostic perspective, earthen structures are some of the most complex that we have. They're also some of the most climate sensitive, which is what feeds some of that complexity. And while we can break apart certain things to certain variables and factors to monitor certain variables, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts from a systems perspective. And I think a lot of people probably here today understand that. And I just wanted to show a quick picture. I was just on site the other day at Pecos National Historical Park, and in one photo, it's so hard to even summarize all of the various complexity that we can see. Hold on, this thing's moving. In an earthen structure, right? If for folks who don't know, Pecos, the original walls there are treated and maintained through an encapsulation of veneers, amended veneer adobes, which increasingly, creates a very complex sort of diagnostic system. You've got the influence of rodent damage, which you can sort of see. You have, differential weathering, differential maintenance cycles. And so it's very difficult to try and understand how all those things are playing against one another in real time. So basically what taking a systems-based approach really means is, again, looking at deterioration of a resource across scales. Frank mentioned macro, meso, micro, but also, there are, when it comes to existing structures, particularly earthen structures, there's way more unknown than known variables. And so we have to try to account for some of that uncertainty in our evaluation. And that usually means trying to account for, material construction, initial design versus what was actually built. So a lot of these things where we call inherent factors, maintenance strategies, things like that, as well as extrinsic factors, that look at differential orientation and exposure, things at what we call the mesoscale, which is, how certain walls affect others in terms of shading, in terms of wind loading. But what we found through these sort of discrete experimentations at Fort Union is that really the thing that makes the most impact is the sort of unknown or unforeseen complex interaction of those factors, which is that sort of level of deterioration mechanism understanding that transcends the intuitive. And so generally what we found is that we have a lot of generic terminology when we apply to earthen structures, but every earthen structure is unique. And so we really want to figure out a way to catalog, characterize, and identify those kind of generic terms, but make them, how do they uniquely manifest at a site? So at Fort Union, for example, we started with a sort of a visual index of those various factors and how they actually manifest at the site, as well as what levels of severity do we see those factors manifesting at. So we try to attribute levels of severity to those things. So taking it that one step further, and then it's on top of this that we build the sort of monitoring approach, for the rest of the site. So now moving sort of into how do we kind of catalog and evaluate those factors over time through monitoring. Again, what I had said earlier, there's way more unknown than we have known factors. And a lot of that means that a lot of the factors that we're trying to understand are things that we can't quantify, things that we can't turn into numbers, so to speak. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we try to develop something that was flexible to incorporate both qualitative and quantitative data formats, and into trying to build this comprehensive picture of how the walls and the site was performing as a whole. And so I'll talk about each of these four things, looking at things like time-lapse photography, looking at things like embedded monitoring, site-wide climatological monitoring. In the bottom right, you see the weather station we put up, and also things like exploratory simulation and computer modeling. So I'll talk about each of those a little bit in turn. So again, building off what Frank said, you have to really look at a resource across multiple scales, and you also have to identify where those scale boundaries exist. Where does the macro end and the meso start, and where does the meso end and the micro start? So kind of listed there in orange are some of the different monitoring approaches that we took and tried out. Things that are looking at, in the micro sense, things that are looking at material behavior, individual building unit behavior, the masonry systems. And then looking at, for example, things at the meso, at the block or room level, how do the walls all interact with one another? And that's looking at things like solar gain and aerodynamic shading, and then trying to build that whole picture on the macro scale, shifting climate baselines. How do we understand the sort of larger trends from an environmental performance perspective? So, getting back to that sort of qualitative, quantitative sort of things I was talking about earlier, we can take time-lapse photography, and in the bottom right, we can over time try to calculate crack propagation. So we can mine quantitative data from a qualitative data source. We can also look at things, fugitive things like, for example, how does, originally we used time-lapse photography to try to measure snow depth. And so you can see the snow pole, the sort of snow gauge in the foreground there. And it turns out there wasn't actually a whole lot of snow sitting on the ground, but what we realized was this pattern of how snow accumulates and builds on a surface, on edges of a structure differentially. And of course, snow is just basically a time lapse. It's a time delayed moisture source. And so these photos are taken over 12 hours. And you can see, well after the snowstorm has sort of passed, you still have that moisture, residual moisture on the north edges of structures. And then we begin to tie that to the very evident deterioration patterns that we see. But then it might be as simple as, okay, looking at historical photographs. This is what it was, and this is what it is now. So how did we get from A to B? And we use all these various monitoring strategies across scales to try and fill in those knowledge gaps. In terms of embedded monitoring, trying to take advantage of a sort of system understanding of the walls, right? So we originally had, moisture sensors embedded, but again, the sort of overall performance of an adobe structure or an earthen structure while it is very sensitive to moisture, as we all know, measuring moisture content is not the only piece of the puzzle that we need. However, we started to look at things like passive RFID tags for moisture monitoring, which are sacrificial in the sense that we don't ever have to remove them from the wall. So dovetailing that with ongoing maintenance of the walls, particularly of the caps at Fort Union, because we all understand that falling damp through a compromised cap is a surefire formula for rapid catastrophic failure of that wall. And so try to dovetail not only the technology, the methodology, an understanding of the architecture and the deterioration mechanisms. We can reduce the cost of the monitoring system, which ensures its longevity and feasibility over time, as well as providing an early warning system for those walls. And then, trying to leverage computational simulation to try to fill knowledge gaps. It's more than a way of creating additional data. It's really to say, how do we explore those factors and interaction of variables for which we cannot collect data? And so that's where computer simulation really steps in. And so here's some early preliminary simulation we did that looks at basically, given sort of average and extreme wind patterns across the site, how do those walls begin to affect one another? So that's at the sort of macro. And now we're going to look in meso, and we're trying to understand, for example, on high solar loaded walls, walls that get a lot of sun, east, west, early in the morning, late in the afternoon, when you pair that with those wind patterns, so where you have a wall that is in a sort of a negative draft zone of wind, where it's not getting any wind movement, a convection across the surface, that's doubled up with solar gain, you get a sort of a compounding increase in the heat transfer coefficient of that surface, which of course speeds up drying. And so you can see how we're starting to put some of these variables together through exploratory modeling. And then again, you know, bringing in that qualitative aspect, right? On the right, you see a photo where you have, you know, understanding how wind moves across that site. In between the depot buildings, which you see there, you get drift snow, right? Heavy wind comes from the south. It hits the south-facing surfaces of those buildings. It passes over the building, and the snow that was being carried then slowly drifts down in between those. And of course, those are shaded. Those are north. That's in the sort of north area of those very tall walls. And that snow will stay there and linger for months. And so that begins to understand why we see increased deterioration patterns on north faces of earthen structure. It starts to put the, you know, build that comprehensive picture. And so that's what we try to do at the end of the day, is take all those various formats, qualitative, quantitative, over longitudinal data formats, and try to build this sort of environmental performance snapshot or picture of how certain walls behave over time, seasonally, and really understand how then we can use that and leverage that to improve you know, maintenance strategies, and also to help prioritize those walls for maintenance. So you know, in conclusion, really, you know, Frank had sort of talked about how a lot of, you know, earthen structures through various deterioration mechanisms, you know, leaning, basal erosion, things like that. You know, they all sort of find their way they all follow a trajectory, you know, entropy and that kind of thing. And they all have a sort of unique end state from a sort of performative aspect. And we just have to understand how our interventions and our treatments and our understanding of what we're doing to that wall affects that end state. And so basically, you know, we have to take our snapshot understanding and monitoring that we're doing and still try to build that overall picture of how the walls are behaving from a systems perspective, and try not to get sort of tunnel vision on any one particular aspect. And I'm going to leave it there. I'll be excited to see if there are questions. Be happy to try and answer them. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Evan. Yes, and please feel free to post your questions on the Q&A, and we'll address those in the second half of the session. It's my pleasure now to introduce Alex Lim from the National Park Service's Tumacácori National Historic Park. Alex?
Hello, I'm Alex Lim with the National Park Service. Good to have you all. I'm in Nogales, Arizona, with Sonora, Mexico, in walking distance. Colleagues from Mexico, hola. Special greetings to you as well. Here are two images of weathering from Arizona. On the left is an entrance wall to the site of Tucson Spanish Presidio. And on the right is the exterior of an adobe building in Fort Lowell, Tucson. Which one is original and authentic to the point in time it was created? And the answer is both. The wall on the left was created some 20 years ago. Amended adobes were abraded and shaped to a wall to mimic a deteriorated adobe wall. Designing a ruin-like wall was deliberate. To the right, the owner decided to expose the 100+ years old adobes and let them deteriorate. Again, this was deliberate. In both cases, the site stewards embraced deterioration to showcase the value of the sites and to suggest an experience. There are other options available, of course, yet I admire the bold and creative use of weathering. Often, earthen architecture sites are marked by few standing walls in the landscape. The walls undergo change as part of a bigger scale transformation. The ground on which the walls stand erode, just as the walls themselves erode. Earthen walls are never isolated from their surroundings, as past two previous presenters showed. When we manage weathering for site stewardship, we can create and maintain a site that is meaningful and pleasant. Others on this call can elaborate better on this idea. I'll just point out that once a ruin is excavated or once a building is left to ruin, we intervene, and that creates a place different from what that site was, or even what it should have, would have, could have been. A heritage site is very much a manifestation of our values and interpretation. Accepting weathering to be seen and to be experienced is the same. When we obscure or deny weathering, then that site may not register as inherited. Instead, it would seem new and even unnatural at times. As we've learned from the previous webinar, even decaying walls are part of a landscape that represents an ancestral connection. Sometimes letting things weather can be the most normal and respectful action. We see sometimes at a heritage site strikingly new intervention with straight lines and sharp edges. Of course, in time, new intervention will weather. The lines will soften and the edges will chip here and there. There is a clear tension between certain interventions and the original form and fabric. Balancing this tension is a critical and necessary part of site stewards. In order to do that, we must first understand weathering and deterioration. At a microscopic level, deterioration is, of course, a function of selected materials. Earthen materials deteriorate rapidly, but materials alone do not bring about change. You need an environment that causes the chosen materials to behave in certain ways or to interact with other matters. So for example, in this photo, the structure under the shelter experiences a different environment compared to the remains in the foreground. How materials are put together, the design and the execution of the intent also impacts the durability. How the construct is used also determines how it'll deteriorate. An abandoned building deteriorates at a different rate than a lived-in building. Finally, how we repair a particular structure controls the rate, intensity, and frequency of deterioration. In other words, when we accept the factors that contribute to change, we can manage weathering and deterioration. Here, I've illustrated the factors that dictate change, and common symptoms such as erosion, disintegration, cracking, detachment, delaminations, falling, flaking, blistering, biogrowth, deformation, and displacement all happen due to the factors at a site. Rarely do they happen in isolation. Certain factors played a greater role than others do. There is a hierarchy. Our job is to fine-tune our eyes for that hierarchy. What I have learned is that considering all 5 factors has led me to an appreciation of a culture that's represented by the place I try to conserve. Let's begin with structures of high integrity. On the left is an adobe building missing a section of stucco, revealing the masonry courses. A section of lime and so render finish and detached. Why? Perhaps the building was left unattended for many years, or perhaps the craftsman's skill was subpar. All of this could have caused a change. To the right, the loss of surface coat is accompanied by even more serious loss, that of partial loss of the wall itself. Did the change happen because of the same mechanism? What is different about the way water moves from the roof? Although on the surface, the symptoms may seem similar, underlying causes can be very different. Here, the progress of deterioration is even more pronounced. Without the roof, the wall top has eroded and the soil has runneled down onto white finish, once an interior space. To the right, you see a fallen adobe wall section playing hide and seek with you. How could only a section of a wall displace while the other parts remain? So again, we need to dive in and examine various factors and rank them. Let me use this image to dissect the process called erosion in more detail. Erosion is much more complex than you think. Consider the rounded wall top. Over time, clay particles separate from sands. The free particles fall to the ground by gravity. Erosion manifests itself by a shortened wall and so deposit at wall base. As the particles travel to the ground, they physically abrade the wall surface, accelerating the erosion. Watery soil basically pour down the walls and behave like a liquid. Another type of erosion takes place at wall base. Water wicked up by capillary action deposits soluble salts from the ground into the walls that crystallize to greater volume. So render adobes, even bricks and rocks break apart because of the expanding salts over time. Notice that the adobes have eroded at a slower rate than the soil mortar has. Why? Adoberos compress the soil mix when making adobes. The opposite happens during construction. Once water evaporates, empty pores. The opposite happens with soil mortar. More water is added to it for workability during construction. Once water evaporates, empty pores develop in the matrix, making it weak. The details in design, construction, and craftsmanship are evident through differential erosion. The details matter. If you want to make a sense of it all, you must have a solid understanding of soil and earthen architecture. That is the very first step in understanding deterioration. Based on what you see, could you guess the area of stucco loss? And how did you come to such decision? In diagnosing a deterioration, and let me dare say in predicting one, what Frank called performance, you begin by connecting the dots. Heritage conservation is empirical, sharing information with the colleagues, reviewing the case studies, talking to people with experience is critical. The cases of failures and successes both matter. But here's the point. After the loss, you begin to think, as the responsible site steward should, that the loss will happen again if the conditions that led to such loss remain the same. So we address the root causes of deterioration to avoid the repeat. Understanding change gives you enormous power to predict future failure. It is a very important step in heritage stewardship because that is how you begin designing an intervention. During the repair on this structure in the fall of 2017, I woke up early to go see it. At dawn, it had rained lightly. It was foggy and there was no one around. It was magical. I could see very clearly how water interacted with the structure. I could only experience this because I've spent some time here. Reviewing the past repair history and photographs also help. And guess what? The areas with repeat repairs are also the areas of repeat deterioration. Understanding deterioration is a multi-front, multi-scalar effort. Here's another example. In March of 2011, I was on a mesa top in Mesa Verde National Park with Frank. The day we arrived, it snowed heavily. Then it melted rapidly the very next day. And there under the crisp blue sky, I learned something fascinating. There was a deformed wall on the left photo. I did not understand why at the time, but when I saw snow melting and water pulling in front of the wall to a muck, I had an aha moment. The soil under the wall became plastic. Because of the weight of the wall had rotated toward that plastic area. But since each end of the wall was tied and anchored, and since the soil mortar on the south face, the wall was also becoming plastic from wetting, the wall was deforming like a bow. It felt as if someone designed a side of a boat using sandstones and soil mortar. What was more insightful was a realization that when the ancestral Puebloans were living there, they would have constructed a drainage system to control such seasonal pattern if the similar situation existed at the time. And when you consider deterioration, do not think you're the first to diagnose it. Deterioration may offer clues to understand past culture. We just don't know sometimes the intricacies of a site and fail to look further because we often assume that we know everything or only look for things we are familiar. I'm going to skip the right side for the interest of time. So my point is really observe change. You often hear people tell you, listen. When I use the word observe, it is like saying, listen. Do not stop there. Record the symptoms visually and with other means. Evan showed great examples. Frank can share a ton. You'll be able to diagnose better and will be helping others to follow in your steps. Repeat this and you are monitoring. And when you get better, you'll be able to predict change. If someone tells you that deterioration in the images are caused by freeze thaw, what would you say? Obviously, you want to see if the temperature drops below freezing, but is that enough for freeze thaw? What else do you need for freeze thaw to damage porous building materials? Are all porous structures the same? I will not explain the whole thing in the interest of time, but let me emphasize this. If any one of the conditions is not met or is contained, deterioration will not happen or at best progress slowly or differentially. Heritage stewardship is a total and holistic process. A symptom you see might be just a small perfect storm happening at a microscopic level. And if you let these small perfect storms go uncared for, they'll become an even greater storm. Also, think about who you're doing it for. Some of the architecture are still living quarters. What you call deterioration could be a totally acceptable condition for people with different cultural beliefs. Let me wrap up. For heritage stewards, change is normal. It sounds ironic considering that we preserve and sustain. But in accepting change, we are accepting that we are willing to observe first before rushing to intrude. In accepting change, we are accepting that we are not the only stakeholders of a place. As with other professional disciplines, earth and architecture conservation starts with the basics. It begins with observing. It begins with understanding soil. It begins with understanding local climate, and it then progresses to appreciating how building materials are put together by different cultural groups. From there, it'll take you to another level. You'll see how a particular culture has come up with a design solution that prevents a wall from getting wet or remaining wet for too long. When you experience all that, then you'll become much more careful in selecting repair materials and methods, since it can fundamentally change what that place will become. So instead of fighting weathering, let's take the time to embrace it. Thank you, and mil gracias.
Thank you, Alex. Our next panelist is Francisco Uviña Contreras from the University of New Mexico. Francisco.
Thank you, Brooks, and a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. So thank you, Brooks, and the panel for the wonderful and well-explained interventions. Welcome everyone to a new seminar with a quite interesting subject, and I hope you enjoyed the prior presentations from all of our panelists. So my presentation will be a combination of sketches and photographs to support my explanation when it comes to the pathologies that these buildings go through in a variety of different conditions. As we have seen in the past presentations, I would like to start with a series of quick sketches showing how a modest adobe structure can fail with the passing of time, especially when they are abandoned and have a lack of maintenance done to them. Observe the first slide showing the start of the metal roof starting to detach, exposing the rafter and roof structure. The following drawing shows how the same building begins to lose most of the metal roof, covering and exposing large amounts of wood structure. Notice how the plasters and the adobe material start to accumulate at the base of the walls. The major reason for these images is that it exposes the vulnerability of a building when it's not in use. In this other sketch, notice how the metal roof sheathing is basically gone, exposing most of the wood members and the slow disappearance of the rest of the wood elements, such as the purlins. Now we have most of the plasters and part of the eroded adobes accumulating at the base of the wall. The last slide depicts how the structure has entered a state of self-standing walls with an accumulation of debris and rubble at its base. The accumulated earth, plaster, and other materials can cause major issues at the base of the walls. It acts similar to a concrete apron, in which it is wicking the moisture and seeking a point of expulsion. This usually takes place where the rubble meets the exposed adobes, as seen in the blue line in the drawing. The capillarity action occurring in these two images are evocative of the sketches shown in the first 4 slides. The previous slides presented the disintegration of the adobe substrate material when exposed to the natural elements. Its mortars, lime plasters, and earthen roof decay and other materials that now sit along the exterior and in some cases in the interior walls as well. Many factors can be taken into consideration, such as rain, snow, wind, and others. The other sketch shows an exterior grade with several inches of backfill sitting next to the wall, a condition detrimental to the adobe walls. These two examples play or relate to the previous drawing sketches. The image to the right which is a large casa or house in the town of Casas Grandes Viejo or Viejo Casas Grandes in the state of Chihuahua, depicts an accumulation of soil from a recent fallen adobe structure that once surrounded a patio or a courtyard. The exterior grade easily accumulated many inches over the original exterior grade of the house. The one on the right depicts one of the many abandoned adobe walls in the southern part of the state of Chihuahua, in the La Hacienda de Sombreretillo. The Hacienda de Sombreretillo was rehabilitated and converted to a seminary for the local diocese in Hidalgo del Parral. Notice how many inches the wall was buried. This extra material came from the earth roofs, plasters, mortars, and some of many disintegrated adobes, from the top and the sides of these walls. This effect can cause major issues where the soil meets the exposed adobes. These two other examples show us the extensive damage where the top of the debris meets the exposed adobe wall. The other factor is the dirt road that runs parallel to the adobe wall, causing the splashing of mud onto the side, contributing to the deterioration of the wall. And the one to the right is actually located in the town of Viejo Casas Grandes as well. The following three slides are showing us a two-story warehouse and molino or mill in the community of La Cueva near the Mora Valley. Some of you might know this site for their famous raspberries grown at the Salman Ranch, which is basically around the corner from this building. Even though the building has good high stone foundations, water filtrations are still making their way into the building. Many factors are causing the wall to settle. But of course, the most problematic is the moisture at its base. The surrounding or accumulated soil next to the building is also causing issues. A positive thing about the molino structure is that the adobes are exposed to the elements and do not seem to be touching the ground or plaster with the use of cementitious plasters. This condition keeps the adobes dry, but the settling of the stone base is affecting the adobe walls and causing them to crack. What about the wind erosion, which is quite a common thing in our dry and arid region? The following slide shows a ruined mission near Viejo Casas Grandes, where the effects of the wind erosion are imminent. This sketch shows how the loose dirt near the and around the site tends to settle along the side of the walls. Of course, it depends on how the prevailing winds impact the wall, causing serious erosion along the face of the wall. Now, this example, this slide, which I already talked briefly about, depicts the accumulation of soil from the eroded walls. Notice the unique hourglass shape of the wall. This is what the wind can cause after years of having the wall exposed to the wind and weather elements. You can imagine the circular patterns created by the wind and cutting into the adobe wall. This next sketch shows the accumulation of snow along the base of the adobe walls. Once again, when possible, immediately remove the snow after a snowstorm to reduce maintenance and the impact of moisture at the base or tops of the adobe walls. Notice how the location of the north wall creates a more problematic area for the snow to melt. The photo to the right is the church in Arroyo Seco near Taos Pueblo and the town. The snow has always been a problematic aspect to the site, especially when people drive by and splash mud and wet snow onto the walls. The photograph shows the church before it was actually intervened. Freeze-thaw, as mentioned in earlier presentation, is a serious problem in cold regions, like northern New Mexico and some parts of the Southwest. Note the dramatic effect or exaggerated effects of a freeze-thaw cycle in the following sketch. It is common when the wall gets wet, and at night when the temperature drops, it freezes the wet areas, and the following day when the temperature rises, the effects on the adobe wall can be a serious loss of material. The following simple sectional sketch depicts earth roof loading on the walls. Do not remove the earth roof. only if you need to replace pieces of wood or need to make serious repairs. The other thing to do, if you are removing an earth roof for repairs, put it back after repairs. But do not forget to place a geotextile down on the deck to prevent the soil from filtering through the roof structure. I will not get into the details of roof construction, but by keeping the load on the walls, it stabilizes the walls and keeps them in place. Note the following photographs for examples. This slide shows a church structure in the Sierra Tarahumara in Chihuahua. Notice the large cracks and corner separations. Perhaps we have several factors affecting the walls, but one for sure is the lack of an earthen roof. And with the poorly constructed roof structure, we now have lateral loads pushing walls apart. The dramatic cracks and structural deterioration was attempted to be remedied with the application of a buttressing system. What about these two images, both of the same church building in the state of Chihuahua? They both show serious structural cracks where they have window openings as well as in its corners. The original Viga roof structure with an earth and lime covering kept the wall stable. Notice the weak and light corrugated metal with a modest truss-like system supporting the metal sheathing. This does nothing for the wall structure, but instead affects the adobe walls from a lack of proper loads on them. These two drawings show a lack of good termination in the downspouts. Notice the damage that a missing pipe can do to an adobe wall. The following slide shows the damage in the Santuario of San Lorenzo in Bernalillo. The wall image shows the serious damage caused on this wall. Not only did it erode the original lime plaster, but also a few inches of the adobe wall. Notice the lime plaster on the wall. It is the only wall in this church plastered with a scored lime plaster with an ashlar masonry appearance. This method of lime plastering adobe walls was commonly seen before the use of cementitious plasters. These two sketches show the difference between a flat roof adobe structure compared to a pitched roof building. They both erode differently. The flat roof structure parapet walls, for example, easily get rounded because of rain, snow, and wind erosion. That is why the Santa Fe style or the Spanish Color Revival style started to utilize round parapet walls in their design of these types of buildings. However, the pitched roofs hold many surprises, from pigeon and rodent droppings to bad guano. It requires constant sealing of all openings to prevent the inhabitants of these pests to occur. Notice the wall, notice the base of the wall where rodents have excavated the lower portions of the walls. This can easily affect the basal structural parts of these adobe walls. Do not apply vapor barriers along the walls. I have seen all kinds of plastic coverings, including geotextiles, that retain small amounts of moisture next to walls. A vapor barrier will retain moisture along the wall that eventually the adobe walls will act like a sponge and absorb the moisture. Beware of this method to prevent rainwater or snow from filtering into your walls. The flower bed sketch or any type of vegetation close to the adobe wall should be a no when it comes to beautifying your building or house. The idea is to try to keep walls safe from roots, large vegetation like trees, or many other types of plants that need actually watering to survive and thrive. Check the two example photos showing two distinct conditions when it comes to vegetation growing too close to the adobe walls. The image to the left shows a fairly large tree or trees growing too close to the adobe wall. This site is in the San Patricio Church in the southern part of the state of New Mexico. Siberian elms are almost impossible to kill. Either you pull them out with the entire root system or you kill it with Roundup in a concentrated solution. These grow where moisture concentrates as seen on the image to the right. I showed this image on the first seminar session. However, this time we are focusing on moisture retention caused by the concrete apron and the vegetation growing around them. It was not difficult to remove, and the damage was caught on time. I still don't see the reason why the concrete apron was actually applied, since the walls were laid in good, solid concrete foundations. And to conclude, remember what our panelists have expressed. Alex Lim mentioned or presented a diagram depicting the use, materials, environmental, climate, repair, maintenance, and design. In this last slide, let's talk about design construction, which he did mention. Not all buildings were made to last. For example, this building was built with a lack of good corner connections. The walls were constructed with a system which consisted of filling large wood forms with stones and mud. The corners are the ones that suffer the most. If the building is affected by weather conditions, or if it's not protected by a sacrificial mud plaster, notice the snow and the poor corner connections or conditions, and how the snow melt and side slopes towards the exterior wall. How do we then control certain erosion factors when it comes to the building and its makeup? How do we make certain buildings stand? Are there ways to improve the structural stability or poorly built structures without affecting their historic integrity? These are questions that maybe we can discuss during the Q&A session. And like Alex said, gracias. And let's take a few minutes, as a break, and then we'll come back to the Q&A questions. I think I beat you to it.
Thank you, Francisco. And thanks to all of our presenters right now. So let's take a 10-minute break. And so we'll come back to begin the Q&A section of the session. All right, welcome back, everyone. And again, thank you to our panelists for great presentations. And I really like the kind of overlapping themes of a systems-based approach and also the emphasis of monitoring, which becomes an important tool as we begin to document deterioration and begin to define some treatment strategies. I want to start talking a little bit about the questions that came up. One of them that's a recurring theme was resources or references for the kind of methodologies that you displayed, Evan. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about whether or not there are existing resources out there. And I'd like to ask the rest of the panels to join in too after that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can certainly try. I'm trying to open the questions thing here. Can you repeat the question again?
Sure.
Sorry.
It's really about, and this goes to even Francisco's presentation, which has some great sketches. And I think there's a common hunger for resources that people could go to other than these videos that they could use for both the methodologies for the work that you're doing, Evan, as well as the kind of sketches that Francisco was showing. So Evan, I'll start with you. Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'd have to dig deep for some formal resources. My whole approach, particularly for that project and that site, was, at the time when I was at Penn, I was in two programs. I was in the environmental building design program, and I was in the preservation program. And so a lot of the things that I ended up doing was taking means and methods that are typically applied to the design, simulation, modeling, exploration of high performance, sustainable new design, and trying to apply those to existing and ongoing challenges and problems and investigations in the sort of preservation world. And so there really, so far as I know, there really isn't anything that's been sort of put down on paper that sort of looks at that process. For example, the simulation work that we were doing, that was using a software called ANSYS, which is, multi-$1,000 thing that usually is used by big A&E firms to do, airflow analysis in buildings and around buildings. We tried to basically say, hey, wind is a huge piece of how Fort Union
weathers. And it's not just wind alone, it's wind-driven rain, it's wind-deposited snow, it's banked snow versus packed snow, it's wind-borne deposits of sand and dirt and scouring and all these types of things. So really, like, it was kind of this linchpin piece. And so, you know, I just looked in my toolbox that I had about what tools that I have that could begin to explore how, or at least try to formalize a lot of the intuitive notions we had about how wind behaves on that site to try to build off of. And, you know, I always say that those tools were never designed for that. So there's huge caveats and there's lists of assumptions that are put in there. But as long as those are made aware, you know, it's good for understanding and identifying relationships of different environmental factors rather than trying to quantify specific things, saying, okay, I've got, you know, wind coming from 183.5 degrees at, you know, 20 meters per second. And this kind of, it's really looking at saying, we've got a sustained wind that comes seasonally out of this direction. How does it play out on the site? And where can we find some, you know, hotspots of interest in terms of differential pressure, you know, which affects moisture drive and all that kind of thing. So long answer, short answer is I don't know of any. I could, if I'm sure my email is probably out there. If you reach out, I could try to pull some things together. I have a bibliography that I could tap into, but formally, I don't know of anything that, you know, we didn't certainly use any reference like that for coming up with those strategies.
Yeah, Francisco. Yeah.
Thank you, Brooks. And I think I actually saw it was Cameron Townsend who talked about the drawings and the sketches. So all those are my sketches of Cameron, and I know Cameron. So they actually are part, except for the first four that I actually sketched, like it was like 2 nights ago when I was putting the presentation together, and just wanted to show like the evolution of deterioration so people can actually capture it, because sometimes we look at deteriorated buildings, but we don't see where they actually started in some cases. So Jake Barrow is here. I actually worked on this handbook, and with back in the day when I was with Cornerstones Community Partnerships, Jake Barrow is part of the organization. I'm no longer with them. I'm now part of the University of New Mexico, but it's a book that you can actually either get from Cornerstones Community Partnerships. Jake, I don't know if you're hearing, but you can also jump in and tell them how to go about in purchasing the book, or if not, you could also order it from Amazon as well. So I started this project when I first got to Cornerstones in the I would say mid to maybe late 1990s, and it's like 2 versions of it. And the one that was published, which is I believe, Jake, you can maybe mention this. It's right there, and you can actually get it through Cornerstones Community Partnerships, and like it says right there, it's the Adobe Conservation a Preservation Handbook, and a very great tool, you know, that really explains like how to, and with great examples in there. And hopefully soon, you know, if we can get our act together, we might be able to do like a revision to it. And but it's available. And Jake, I don't know if you want to jump in and tell us a bit about it.
Well, you know, I'm glad to, but I think you know a lot more about it than I did, because you were around participating when this was written and I wasn't. But it is rather thorough, and it's very easy to follow. And so it's not overly scientific in any way, but yet the drawings are quite detailed, and it covers a variety of the whole variety of topics, the terminology and tools, all about Adobe and how to proceed step by step with an appendix and all of that. And we did recently get this reprinted, and it's available here. You just contact us, and we do sell it at $35 a copy. But we have them available, and like Francisco said, we're anxious to work on an update and bring it up to date, and we just haven't been able to get around to that. So with that, I'll sign off.
Thank you, Jake.
Great. Yeah, Frank.
I just I want to say that I think it's really important that those listening today realize that the methods, for example, that Evan discussed, which were part of this larger project, was really meant for a proof of concept to explore with actually the entire range of methods, from very simple rapid assessment survey identifying the vital signs of adobe construction or earthen construction to very complex computational analysis. The idea was to look at each decay mechanism alone and in combination, and try to tease out a method by which one could assess earthen architecture through a checklist of factors that could reasonably play into the cumulated deterioration conditions that one sees. I'm very suspect of expert systems. I think they have a place, but they really are meant to challenge our own powers of observation and then go to the next level to confirm what appears to be the problem. I think to the former question about, is there some published method out there? I think what there is a way to proceed, a methodology for what to consider when looking at deterioration mechanisms and weathering, and then to take it from there. For example, not to consider construction methods, original, not to consider previous treatments, not to consider the environment. How can you explain the photos that Evan showed of two nearly identical walls at Fort Union that weathered completely differently? They're constructed the same, maybe, but they certainly were in different environments. This is, I think, the point. There is no cookbook approach, but what there is methodology. And I think that's what really has to be stressed here.
Thank you, Frank. Yeah, anyone else want to add to that? Great. The next question from Rochelle, who is part Lobo, part Wildcat, is asking Francisco about the how far away should you plant a tree from the adobe? You mentioned planters next to adobe buildings are a no-no, but what do you recommend? Because as she says, it's great for energy conservation.
Hi, Rachel. How are you? The half Wildcat, half Lobo, and she was part of our class. Was it like 2 summers ago? I think, Rachel. So she did amazing work. So I would say depends on the tree. First of all, I recently, like, not me, but I actually hired somebody to cut like a 6-foot diameter cottonwood that was next to my house, and it was already causing issues. And my house is adobe with a stone veneer. It's probably from the 50s. It has good concrete foundations, but you could already start to see how that tree was pushing against the wall. So it all depends. If you're eventually going to be dealing with branches falling on your roof, eventually going into your foundations as well. So I think it depends on you. If you are going to be growing a tree next to the house, make it far enough where it's not going to be invasive in the next 15, 20 years. And then eventually you're going to have to be paying tons of money, to remove it. Plus, it's going to save you a lot of headaches when it comes to that type of trees. Some trees, that it depends also on the root system as well. Some grow out, some grow down. So it also depends on the species of the tree. But I would say, if you are going to be doing that, I would say probably a minimum of 10 feet if you are going to be growing a tree. And then it also depends, like I said, the species of the tree and how big they actually get. So they give you beautiful shade and wonderful, climatic. It really helps when it comes to the summer or hot, months, especially in Arizona. But be careful, when you're planting something next to an adobe structure or building.
Great, thank you, Francisco. And the next question has to do with bond beams. And Francisco, you mentioned the scenario where if earth is taken off of the flat roof, it actually creates a bad situation. But what happens when it's been replaced by a pitched roof? This is Jackie Stark that's asked that question.
Well, I mean, if you go to the code will tell you that you either have to, in new construction, you need to put a concrete bomb beam on it, yes. However, in a historic building where there is some sort of a plate, if you're lucky, it might be running around, hopefully the building, connecting all corners, and then you're adding a roof over it, which will keep the walls fairly stable. So there's two ways of doing it. One can be concrete. Concrete doesn't have to be, because of its weight, doesn't have to be attached to the other walls because of the heavy material. However, if it's wood, then you need to figure out a way to basically attach it to the top of the walls. Because what happens if you don't have any weight on top of that plate, you have a loose roof, and eventually in a gust of wind, it can easily, pick up. So there's, I won't go into like all the details, Brooks, or can I just really quickly? So
go ahead.
So if you are going to put a wood plate or replacing one, if you don't have one, there's two different ways, and there's probably others, but one would be to strap it. And I usually prefer to use like thinner straps, like vinyl, or these like the ones that you basically use for like the straps, the ones with the crank. You can also use metal, but I try to, move away from metal because it actually cuts more, especially when it's flat. So you basically are drilling through the adobe wall, bringing them to the top, nail basically the plate to it, and you will be basically preventing like the gust of wind, to pick up your roof. And then the rafters have to be applied or nailed or somehow attached to this plate. The other, which is a really unique one, and actually, saw it in a building from the early 1800s, was basically using a wood plate, like also like 4 courses down, with a long bolt that basically went all the way to the top, and then a wood plate drilled. You place the plate, and then you basically put a nut, onto it. And that basically is now you actually, instead of having a concrete bomb beam, now you have, a bomb beam, if you want to see it this way, that is now, many tons, the weight. So that also can keep the roof down as well. So there's many ways. And I think each building, if you are replacing or repairing or doing anything with it, so there's different ways of actually making these types of anchors and applications, when it comes to a wood bomb beam, which I prefer. That's the truth. Okay. So sorry, I'm not going into all the extensions and the details.
Great. And I want to remind our listeners in the audience that you'll see that some of our panelists are answering questions in the Q&A box. So make sure that you take a look at those answers then as well. I'm wondering, Evan or Frank, if you wanted to comment on the question that was asked earlier about how you choose particular ways to render against Adobe versus plastering. Evan, go ahead.
I was gonna say, see if Frank wanted to do it, but I texted a little bit in there in the chat about several sites do that where they apply the current strategy at Fort Union is relies almost solely on the application of a sacrificial amended shelter coat, what they call them, which is 2 parts unamended base layer that touches that actually makes contact with the original, and then there's an amended outer layer, and that has a lot to do with reversibility and things. And that's actually it's a tried and true sort of very simple tried and true methodology for protecting the walls from physical erosion and deterioration. A lot of it has to do, like I said, with wind-driven rain and scouring and erosion and things like that. But ultimately, with that type of approach, you have to, again, from a systems perspective, understand how that additional layer to that system will affect the original material when it ultimately fails, right? So whenever you add a protective barrier like that, whether it's a shelter coat, whether it's a vapor barrier in a wall assembly, cavity wall assembly type of thing, whether it's a paint on, spray on vapor barrier type thing, they will ultimately fail, right? And that's not a question. It's a guarantee, and you have to then understand how that new layer will then affect the original layer when it fails, right? So when a shelter coat fails, particularly if it's amended, regular shelter coats actually have a really great sort of self-healing mechanism. If they're not amended, when they crack, once they get wet, they actually begin to heal themselves and seal themselves back up. Amended shelter coats do not do that. So what ends up happening, particularly on the tops, on the caps, is you see these cracks forming that do not heal. And now you have basically a blanket over your wall that's wet from the inside and actually prohibits drying of that wall to the exterior through sun and wind exposure and that kind of thing. So in that situation, you now have an accelerated deterioration mechanism because of the thing that you added as a treatment. And so really, whenever you're picking any kind of treatment or any sort of implementation or intervention, you have to sort of play it forward, chess style, 4 or 5 moves ahead. What's going to happen when it fails? In some cases, if that is more severe or detrimental than doing nothing, doing nothing is always also an option. But there's something in between there that has to, like, all the alternatives have to be laid out, into the future. And it's not just the lifespan of the building, it's the lifespan of the treatments as well. So hopefully that was not too confusing.
Frank, do you want to add anything to that?
I answered the question in the Q&A, but I would just maybe add that I think it's really important to say that the context of the heritage, whether it's a fragmented building or a living whole building, completely dictates the response. There are 2 very different contexts that will, even though diagnoses might be the same, the end result of intervention, which should be based on that diagnostic and the enabling environment, such as maintenance, or ability to change a structure, I think that really dictates the intervention. I know we're supposed to be talking about weathering and decay mechanisms, but on the subject of intervention, I think there needs to be a major overhaul in our thinking about how to approach earth as a material of heritage. We have taken principles and practices learned from monumental and permanent materials like masonry, and we've applied them to earthen heritage. And I think we got to rethink that. It is not equatable, and it doesn't just reduce itself to the argument of living and dead. That's not really the issue. The issue is we have to accept earth for all its perfect imperfection, and we have to work with it. Evan mentioned the adaptation. This is something we're very interested in. Why not allow buildings to achieve a certain stasis through deterioration and then manage them in that condition rather than trying to continue to make them perfect or unalterable? It's a fool's game, and I think we really need to rethink this. And it goes fundamentally back to how we have approached and understood the material. It's not a technical problem, really.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to chime in and make a plug for the 5th of this series of SICRAT, which talks about management priorities, because there's multiple factors that are involved, particularly on sites on public land, where there is a series of management factors involved in how to make it accessible and interpret the site, and then how do you handle the technical sides of actual intervention on the material itself. And so I'm just making a plug for that session, because I think we'll get into this in a lot more detail. There is a question in the Q&A about using our ancestors' methodologies, and I'm not sure what is meant by that, but from your perspectives, panelists, are there ancestral methodologies that have not really been considered that should be considered? don't all jump in at once.
Can
Go ahead,
I,
Francisco.
yeah, I think that, and I think it's very, very important to note the, I guess the amazing architecture that they left behind, you know, the ancestral Puebloan people, but also the continuation of that, the materiality that still exists in a lot of the pueblos. Yes, because it's not like they abandoned these archaeological sites or, you know, moved somewhere else and shifted, and all of a sudden we start, you know, from scratch. I mean, they brought that knowledge along, and first it was masonry, and eventually became puddled earth. And eventually, when the colonists, you know, arrive, you know, it becomes more of a masonry unit, which is the adobe, and that's basically what we know. But I think I would say yes, and because they also have lots of knowledge. I mean, they're still here; they haven't left, you know. And I'm working with Santo Domingo Pueblo and with an architect. But it's one of the things that, and I was actually just talking about this earlier, is that the HUD, you know, rules, you know, a few years back, you know, where they wouldn't allow people to build, you know, adobe houses and their housing. So there's sometimes a break when it comes to that building tradition, you know, in many of these pueblos or ancestral, you know, sites. And that becomes a problem. It becomes a problem for those people, you know, that are wanting, you know, to present, to show that, you know, it's a viable material and they can continue building with it. But I've been having issues when it comes to Santo Domingo and not having them somehow, you know, come together. You know, this is an intangible aspect in their pueblos and in their indigenous communities, and not wanting to, or trying to figure out the cost or the economics of it, and if it's viable for the community to, you know, to continue building with adobe or not. So it's I think it's in danger, you know, of at least in many communities, of the continuation of building with these types of earthen materials. So, and that's basically what I can say. Sorry, I expanded a bit more than what the question was about.
Sure. No, thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, and I just got a text from Alex Lim, who apparently lost his connection. So I see that there's a question there for him. And I'm wondering about this idea of how we continue to, or the amount of time and energy it takes to monitor. This was one of the things that Alex brought up in his presentation, and it's such a critical component of the documentation and treatment. I'm wondering if anyone would like to comment on how monitoring can be done in an efficient way. Maybe start with you, Evan.
Well, you know, it's sort of one of those things where you have to crack tons of eggs before you find the cheapest egg to use. And you know, we tried so many different things. We started with the sort of industry standard ones, you know, embedded moisture sensors in the wall, in the ground, you know, because we were all running off of that very well-known fact that, you know, earthen structures are susceptible to moisture. Everybody knows that. And in most cases, it's the catalyst for pretty much all deterioration, but it's never the only catalyst. And because of that, you know, we had all this data that we collected for this pilot wall that we were looking at, and it still didn't really tell us anything about why that particular wall was deteriorating, or was it a proxy for understanding or predicting, I try to use that word lightly, predicting if that wall was going to collapse. I mean, it's a much more complex picture. You know, are there patches and repairs in that wall underneath that shelter coat? That's one thing I failed to mention earlier. The shelter coats really work, but they also hide all of the scars and repairs and incipient damage mechanism. You really have no idea that they're there until you remove that shelter coat, which is sort of counterintuitive to a lot of people, right? Why would you take that thing off if it's the thing that's keeping the building standing or the wall standing? So it's a constant, you know, multivariate sort of balancing act. But to get back to the question, you know, we started with we tested out several different monitoring strategies, and it turns out actually that the one that's the most effective and also the cheapest was simple survey monitoring, lowercase m monitoring. It's not the fancy formal, bells and whistles, data loggers and data and all that kind of thing. But it was the one that was the most feasible, required very little training. We actually developed it with the crew at Fort Union. They were part and parcel that, they basically developed that thing because they were, they had a huge stake in doing it. So they totally understood its sort of relevance. And so it was easy to develop, easy to change over, as needed to adapt to that site. It was repeatable year to year. And, we were building off the fact that that site does a sort of informal survey every year. And so we said, if we can take the same sort of questions and just ask them in a slightly different way, we can get answers and information that tells us something about trends and deterioration over time. And they can still get the information, the crew can still get the information they need to do cyclic maintenance every year. So it was a win-win. So that's actually that was the overarching sort of best monitoring strategy for that site, because that actually tells you how the walls are behaving as systems. It's, when you're looking at monitoring in terms of moisture monitoring or any of the sort of other pinpoint variables, you're looking not only at snapshots in time, but you're looking at snapshots in space. You have to choose where you put those sensors. So if you don't put them in the right place, not only is the data not in the right format, it's not even telling you what you need to know in the right place. So that's why we started, for example, to look at the RFID tags. You put in the photo I put in my presentation, that there was a bucket with some wires and stuff in it. That was our weatherproof enclosure for the weatherproof enclosures. After 2 years, water, sand, snow blew all the seals out, killed all the batteries, fried all the board. I mean, there's no way on a site like Fort Union, there's no such thing as weatherproof. Weather is the dominating force out there. So that was a big piece of it. It was expensive. It was hard to maintain. We had to train people how to do all that. And then when you put a sensor like that in, you have to pull it back out, which is just as damaging as it was to put in. So also counterintuitive. So then we started to look at things like the passive RFID tags, which are not so much as high tech, so to speak, as the sensors. They're the equivalent of, if you want to know if it's windy outside, you sort of lick your finger and say, yep, it's windy. It's more windy than it was. It's less windy than it was is right now. But when you pair that with an understanding of the failure modes, right? The caps fail, and also dovetail it with, integrating it with maintenance strategies, the sense that if they repair the cap, we can put those sensors in below a couple courses of the cap. And if we're getting after a heavy rain, we're not collecting data every 15 minutes. We said, hey, there's a heavy rain, go out there, shoot it with the reader. If it's wet 3 courses down, you definitely have a problem somewhere in there. And then that opens up the conversation to go in there with a finer tooth comb and, do a graphical condition assessment or a more in-depth analysis. And so those little tags are about $2 a piece. And once you put them in, you never have to worry about them. So that's taking a $10,000 monitoring software and system and data and processing of that data over time and labor. And you're minimizing that down to maybe a couple $100. Because you're taking advantage of that first understanding how that wall behaves as a system. So long answer, but yes, there are ways.
Yeah, Frank?
Monitoring like maintenance is the best way to ensure preservation for earthen structures. And I want to make a plug for legacy data. A building is an accumulation of all the conditions, all the things that have happened to it up to the moment you look at it. So if you can learn to read a building's response to the environment, to previous treatments, and it doesn't have to be a 10-page survey form, it can really focus on what we call the vital signs. But to identify those vital signs, I hope, as we've all discussed in our presentations, takes some skill in terms of weighing the factors in a hierarchy, right? I mean, we can all list the things that affect earthen buildings. The question is, what is more at play than another? And what are the extenuating circumstances of orientation or climate or past treatments? This is the trick. But it all starts with a fairly simple, repetitive, and reproducible form of monitoring. There are organizations that invest a great deal of money in monitoring through condition survey, but every time you change the rules, when you do that condition survey, you render that monitoring useless. So it's really important to get the concept and then play it out. But this is, I think monitoring and maintenance are the two most important things we can say about preserving earthen heritage.
Great, thank you. I just want to make sure Jake saw the Q&A question about the Cornerstones publication, and Jake, if you could answer that directly on the Q&A box, I would appreciate it. Alex, welcome back. Sorry you had some connection problems. There was a question here directly directed at you, and I'm wondering if you remember it and could address it. You're on mute, Alex.
I do, and I was typing it and the connection was entirely lost. So now I'm connecting via my cell phone. The question was about how vernacular architecture changes and how does embracing weathering ensures its survival. Vernacular architecture, let's say by the Native American groups in both Mexico and the US, they are in a way whole another category where you look at something fail and their response would be because they have the knowledge of how to rebuild them. Unlike, let's say, Spanish colonial mission church, or let's say a building remains in Wapaki somewhere where there's the connection and then living understand the traditional knowledge of building construction was totally lost. Or maybe you have some passed down to you but have changed over time. Vernacular architecture by Native American groups are totally different category. And I'm not a Native American person per se, but as a Korean where there's a similar tradition out there in Far East Asia, I can say that in such circumstances, they sometimes just rebuild the whole building because they have that knowledge. They can build another one right next to it and just let the other one fail and just turn it into a storage space. I've traveled in the Otam Reservation many years ago, and I've come across so many of these traditional buildings with flat roof on saguaro cacti, viga, galatillos, supported on mesquite horquetas, those posts, and then between these posts, kind of wattle and dab structure, where in one of my images. These are, for them, it's just no big deal. They don't necessarily have to invest a lot of time to reconstruct it. Some do. Some totally turn it into a different construction method. I've seen in a very arid climate in reservation somewhere where they use Portland cement stucco. And I asked them, Martin, doesn't it give you a hard time if you have this? Isn't it incompatible with the traditional method you have? And the answer is, well, we rarely get rain. So for him, it was the most practical choice, and he had no problem. And he had that flexibility that wasn't bound by any particular set of material or method. He could choose. So that's what I was trying to type in answering your question. The survival of these sites are not necessarily bound by your obligation to use a certain set of materials. And you don't have maybe, and I can say I have a right to tell them that. They, as the tradition bearers, they have the final say. And if they say, well, we don't want it, you have to accept it. But in the long run, through change and that flexibility, the appreciation for climate, for available material, that's the most sustainable materials out there, they have that resilience built in to cope with any change, whether it's climate or whether some other changes. So that's what I wanted to say. I mean, yeah, in 50 minutes, it was hard to say all that, but
Well, and I also want to,
go across.
yeah, no, thank you, Alex. And I also want to make sure that we differentiate national parks and the role that they play in preserving our nation's heritage versus what happens outside of the parks in ancestral lands and by ancestral communities then too. Great. Then in closing, I want to thank all of our panelists today. I want to thank Francisco, Evan, Alex, and Frank for their participation, and also to the audience participants who provided questions. A reminder that a recording of this session will be available on the Missions Initiative website in the next few weeks, and we'll also send out a notice to all of the participants. We'd also like you to fill out a very quick evaluation form, the link for which is available in the chat box and will be sent out to all of the registered participants in this session. So please take a minute to provide us any feedback so that we can continue to improve this program. And finally, I'd like to ask you to join us next week for our next SICRAT 2021 session. It's on soils and material selection. You'll have heard in the previous sessions many references to that, and we have a whole session just dedicated to soils and material selections. So if you haven't registered for that one, please go to the SICRAT 2021 website to do so. And we look forward to seeing you all next week and next year in New Mexico. And so long for now. Thank you.